the Bane Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, sleek ships make shimmering shifts through pumpernickel skies, ruining the old god's hardtack.
Dang.
A crab of insectoid aliens, and an epiphany of baby stars.
Plus, we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of David Drake's The Sea Without a Shore. All right now. Welcome to the Bane Free Radio Hour podcast. It's an honor to have you along. I'm Bane editor Tony Daniel.
And I'm editorial assistant Christopher Rocchio.
We have part one of a two-part interview with Charles E. Gannon this time, discussing the fourth entry in his Caine Riordan science fiction series. This one is called Caine's Mutiny. In this one, Caine travels to a very forbidding planet to meet an alien species so weird its name can only be spelled in multiple consonant clusters. It's a really entertaining new entry in the series, and Chuck will tell us all about it.
And, of course, we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of The Sea Without a Shore by David Drake. Now, here's the news.
We have new e-arcs at the Bane eBooks website. Now, an e-arc is the path a cliched meme travels from the receiver of a telephone or other listening device through the hindbrain, but not the frontal cortex, until it is blathered again out the mouth into the device voice pickup to be passed on like a parasite to unsuspecting populations.
No. An e-arc is an electronic advanced reading copy, which is an early version of a book we make available for you on baneebooks.com. If you absolutely can't wait for your favorite book to be released, you can grab a copy, full of typos and all, a few months early on baneebooks.com.
Early, but they are full of the kind of things that proofreaders will catch when we actually put the print book out. So you get the book in your favorite series or whatever earlier, but you also get it with some telling defects, if you want to call them that, or interesting, unique features, if you want to call them that. So what e-arcs do we have available?
Just out in e-arc form is The Gathering Edge by Sharon Lee and Steve Miller. Hey, this is a series milestone as we welcome the 20th amazing entry in the nationally best-selling Liaden Universe series. The luck runs rough around Theo Whately. People are trying to kill her and capture the self-aware, intelligent ship Betchemo, to whom Theo is bonded. Theo and her crew need a break, but when they retire to what Betchemo refers to as safe space, they find that things are leaking through from another universe and another time. In fact, whole spaceships are coming through, and one of those ships' crews may be members of Theo's ancient ancestral line. Now Theo has a choice to make. It seems that Betchemo's safe space is about to become deadly perilous.
Also out is a really fun collaboration, The Gods of Sagittarius, by Eric Flint and Mike Resnick. In this one, the human race's most brilliant savant has become convinced that the race of ancient aliens known as the Old Ones possessed powers unknown to any modern intelligent species. He believes they had harness forces, which may well have been actual magic, giving the Old Ones the stature of gods. Now human adventurers and an alien species are on a collision course with the truth. Despite their many differences, only if they unite their forces do they stand any chance of surviving the coming encounter with the gods of Sagittarius.
E-arcs for The Gathering Edge by Sharon Lee and Steve Miller and The Gods of Sagittarius by Eric Flint and Mike Resnick are now available at baneebooks.com.
This is part one of a two-part interview with Charles E. Gannon discussing his new novel in the Caine Riordan series, Caine's Mutiny. Part two will be available next time on the podcast. I want to welcome Charles E. Gannon to the podcast. Hello, Chuck.
Hi, Tony.
Chuck Gannon is the Compton Crook Award-winning creator of the Caine Riordan science fiction series. He's the co-author with Eric Flint of 1635, The Papal Stakes, and 1636, Commander Cantrell in the West Indies. Am I getting all the Ring of Fire books in that list?
Yes, you did.
Okay. And with Steve White, he co-authored 2 books in the long-running Starfire series, Extremist and Imperative. He's written stories set in David Weber's Honorverse and many other short stories. Chuck is a member of Sigma, the SF think tank, which has advised various intelligence and defense agency. He lives in Annapolis, Maryland. The first 3 books in the Caine Riordan series, Trial by Fire, Fire with Fire, and Raising Caine, were nominated for a Nebula Award, and now out at booksellers everywhere is Caine's Mutiny, book 4 in the Caine Riordan series. Chuck, Caine has come a long way since he awoke from cryo-suspension just 3 or 4 years ago in the series timeline. Can you kind of broadly bring us up to speed on where we are at the start of Caine's Mutiny?
Well, if we go from that moment of him waking up out of cryo sleep, he goes to Delta Pavonis 3, finds evidence that there are in fact exosapients. At least there were a long time ago. Turns out that the neighborhood is not depopulated, and they sort of report in. Humanity goes, meets them. That turns out to be not the best thing. Not because it was an ambush in the military sense, but kind of an ambush in the political and diplomatic sense. It's basically a kind of, I guess you could say, a very small future UN that has just all the sort of game playing and agendas that our own does. And so there's the inevitable war, which he survives after becoming an unintended Trojan horse that helps resolve that conflict. As a human victory, he is brought onward into the counter campaign to one of the invaders' homeworlds, the homeworld of the Arat-Kur, who are, if you will, they're described as sort of subterranean horseshoe crab cockroaches, and mammalian, no less. Where actually he manages to stop their genocide, which was perhaps the end game of this war. In the process of so doing, he uncovers that one of the 3 species that were in fact carrying out this invasion of Earth, if you will, the ones that were working as advisors rather than participants, known as the Kator, who were thought to be the most alien of all creatures, living in a sort of ultra-cold environment, large hot water tank, something about the size of a water tank, turn out, in fact, to be humans, and humans who had been separated from our root stock some very, very long time ago, which in the next book, which is our attempt to find allies. The Slasrithi are pretty much the most friendly species we found, if quite enigmatic, and they essentially say, well, if we're gonna have diplomatic relations, you actually kind of have to see us. You got to get to know us, not across the table, but by visiting our worlds, which turn out to be very strange worlds with very unusual biota on them. And it also turns out that there is, in the best style of, I guess you could say, Alistair MacLean always did this. There was always the mole inside the organization, whether that was Guns of Navarone or Ice Station Zebra. Well, I only steal from the best, so if I have 1 or 2 in this diplomatic mission, which is almost completely destroyed, but at the end of the day manages to save enough of itself to essentially not only successfully complete its mission, but by surviving to complete its mission, show that the Kator were behind this attempt at destruction as well, in the course of which we learn a little bit more about the Kator, the survivors of whom have taken realizing that this ploy did not work, and being outcasts from their own society, decide to, if you will, adopt another emergency ploy, which is very much related to where the book Caine's Mutiny begins, which is that humans have returned, Caine and what's left of the diplomatic party have returned, and they learn that there's a problem in Hukruch space. The Hukruch, the Arat-Kur, and the Kator were the 3 antagonist species during the invasion of Earth. The Hukruch, by far the least technologically advanced and also by far the most overtly aggressive of the group. And that is where Caine et al. Are going to have to go, because there could be a very, very severe diplomatic incident brewing. if somebody doesn't go and intercede, and that's Caine's job.
Yeah. Where they're going is the planet. How do we say this? Thorxar, and that is that's a colony world. Can you sort of describe the interspecies commonwealth, or what do you call it, and how it works in the vicinity of Earth? What we've gotten ourselves into, humanity, or not into yet?
So
we haven't signed on, I don't think.
It's called the Accords, and the Accords. There aren't really many races out there, and this is not galactic. It's a lot smaller in scale than that. It's about Earth has had, I guess you could say, information drop that suggests that maybe the limit of explored or at least visited space is about 150 light years radius out from about where Earth is. And the Accord occupies a fairly small volume of that space. Why that is left for later revelation. But that's where it is right now. And the member species, in addition to the Kator, who at the very end of the second book turn out to be humans, which is going to be a problem later on down the line, in addition to the fact that they are mystifyingly antagonistic towards us. The Arat-Kur, who are not particularly warlike, subterranean, and the Hukruch, who are these, they stand about 6.5 to 6 3/4 feet. They are heavily built. They are very tough hombres, and they have a culture to boot. The other two species out there are the Slasrithi. They're very different. They are polytaxic, which means that sort of like ants, although they're nothing. They are physiologically not at all like ants. As a matter of fact, some people have described them as ostrich chimps because they have ostrich-like necks with small heads that aren't really heads. They're sensor clusters, and there's a sort of gibbon-like body. And but all those are, again, they're crude terrestrial analogies for what the actual alienness of the physiology is. And they are like as I was saying, they're polytaxic, which means like ants, all the same species, but you'll have a bunch of different castes which actually have significant physical differences. That is true also for the Slasrithi. They are as non-aggressive, you might say, as the Hukruch are aggressive. And the last, the ones who also provide the group called the custodians of the Accord, who make sure that the rules are followed, more or less, are the Dornani. The Dornani are by far the oldest of all the races, and they are, for anybody who's read the first book, you'll know that they are a connector to an earlier time in the history of this stellar cluster that goes back 10,000 and more years. So, and that's a part of the series which really hasn't been, I guess you could say, that layer of the onion has not been peeled back yet. Quite frankly, because Era hasn't had the time. We've been too busy saving our own bacon, and the basics of the Accord are that it is non-aggression, non-interference, and but it isn't really an alliance in any way. It's a sort of group modus vivendi.
So Earth hasn't formally joined yet, right? We're holding out for strategic reasons, or is humanity part of it?
Nope, we have not. And that creates some consternation amongst the Dornani. The Dornani really, the Dornani collective, which is the speciate organization of the Dornani, their representation to the Accord themselves, was hoping we would, for a whole variety of reasons. Not the least of which is they're really tired of being the custodians, and they're really not doing a very good job about it. And there are reasons for that, which you get hints of in all three of the first books, and even then again the fourth book, but will become very much unfolded in the fifth book, Mark of Cain. Because whereas the first three books have had us essentially visit, or I should say now 4 books, will have had us visit most of these species to some degree in their home environments and turn essentially first contact into deep contact. The ones we haven't really met yet are the Dornani, and that is who we meet in Mark of Caine. And I don't think it would be at all, telling tales out of school to say, I can't wait to write that book. That book is, that one I've had my eye on for a long time. I get all of them, but this one is one of those sort of big idea where you're encountering a race that has been around for a very long time, has a very different perspective, and has reached some points in its own evolution, which I think really are in connection with what I like best in science fiction is, as it's represented as a single word, sense of wonder, and this is definitely a novel which has considerable depths of sense of wonder. So we have not joined, despite the fact that the Accord, and there are a bunch of reasons for that, and that changes over time. At the end of the fourth book, so this is one of those spoilers you can't give out. It turns out that there were lots of good reasons for us not to join. Initially, it's because the Accord is in a state of almost disrepair after the war that our entry triggers. It's really there aren't even enough almost voting powers left. We would sort of be written in. Our membership would always be questionable as to whether it was really done by essentially executive fiat by the Dornani themselves, the custodians, or whether it was a genuine broad-based admission. And also, the other thing that's kind of important is that we are still right now a protected species, which means if there are certain laws we don't break, we don't have to obey the other accords. And one of the accords is that exploration and exploitation of planets is done according to, if you will, preset vectors through space. This is to make sure that the species of the accord do not run afoul of each other, don't step on each other's expansionistic toes, as the case may be. Well, we don't have to follow that. This was not something that the writers, the crafters of the accord, ever really foresaw. But we see it, and we say, you know what? We're gonna pass on that whole accord thing right now, and we're going to use these much longer range ships that we've taken as a result of the end of the war in the second book, and we are going to essentially go on a bit of a land grab. The rationale behind it being, in the first war, they were at Earth within essentially a month, between the start of the campaign and the time that they actually had control of orbital space at Earth was less than a month. And our strategic thought was that can't happen again. We need more buffer. We need more backyard too. And so that's one of the reasons why we have not joined the Accord at this point.
Well, tell us more about Caine. He's a polymath. I think you've said. What is it about this characteristic that seems to always put him in the center of the action of the books, and just the center of the action of humanity right now? He has the skill of being a jack of all trades, intellectually as well as in other ways, right?
Well, yes, and perhaps not exactly your classic action hero in that. Unlike a lot of action heroes come with a military background. He comes to the books with military sensibility. He is essentially a defense analyst, and he's reported on defense analyses as a sort of analytical writer and things like that. And he has, in the course of that, had a lot of contact and even done a little bit of training just to know how. But he is not from a military background.
Tell me a little bit more about Caine's character as well. He's not exactly a smart aleck, but he is not one to suffer fools gladly sometimes.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. Although I always, in the course of the series, I'm always sort of finding that Caine is biting his tongue.
Yeah, I mean, he's a negotiator too. I mean, I'm not saying that he's like some Ahab or something.
No, but I think one of the things, and we'll probably touch on this maybe as we get into talking about some of the other, for instance, characters in this most recent book, like Yargrau. Going back to the notion of his being a polymath and it puts him at the center of the action, it really only puts him at the center of the action in the first book. And the reason for that is because all of a sudden we have a first contact scenario. Well, there isn't exactly you don't find that in the what ads. Let's post an ad for a guy or gal who'll be good with first contact. Nope, that's pretty much not a known job description. So to some degree, it's a case of him being in the wrong place at the right time, and also having, as you said, being a jack of all trades. One of the things that a polymath tends to do is they tend to think and see the world paradigmatically. In other words, they don't tend to accept conventional roles for conventional objects. As somebody says at one point, you and I see a screwdriver. He sees that. He sees a pendulum bob. He sees a weapon. He sees a paperweight. He sees a wedge. He sees all of these things. And that's one of the things that polymaths tend to do. They can tend to be idiosyncratic at times because they're not functioning with the same sort of set equivalencies. This object does that thing. This concept is useful in this situation. Polymaths will tend to think paradigmatically. So will this pattern we see in biology actually apply to sociology? Does that apply to understanding psychology, et cetera, et cetera? It's the same way that you see with Da Vinci, for instance, that the seamless integration, if you will, of an eye that could dissect the wings of a bird in flight becomes the one that then can try to represent that in terms of engineering design, but then also writes about it and can write about it with the focus on the beauty of bird flight. This is somebody who's taking things that would normally be seen in one frame of reference and migrating that reference throughout all the other fields that might apply. That's one of the things that makes him also in the first contact scenario, the very first of the first contact scenarios, indispensable. He is less strongly moored to human preconceptions. That allows him to hear and to see what's going on with the other species and not necessarily be filtering it through an inevitably human lens. Or at least if he is, he's aware that that's what he's doing. So while that's important the first time out, and by the way, in the first book, you could arguably say, is when he's most successful, given the tasks he's given. And that was always intentional, because the further away he gets from his original comfort zone, the more he's encountering, newcomer syndrome, where success is, ability to control the situation is sort of slipping away from him. So while he's learning more skills, he also tends not to have the same sort of initial high success level that he did. But once he's, of course, been successful in that first contact scenario, well, now he's the go-to guy, because they look around and they say, well, who's done first contact? Well, we've got one guy.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, as time goes on, the people who are traveling with him are getting some of that cred as well. But in these first 2 or 3 books, the reason he is sort of the first person in is because they say, well, who do we know can do this? Well, we've only got one person we absolutely know. Well, guess what? So that's kind of how I would say his polymath nature gets him in the door, and then it helps him stay there because it's that same sort of not tied to conventional perspective that helps him very often in, if you will, unraveling some of the intentional mysteries and some of just the mysteries of, we've never seen this before, what the heck does this mean, that he encounters along the way. But it is increasingly just simply because he's done it that puts him in the center.
He's also very, very loyal and courageous as well, of course, which is a cool part of his character. So, speaking of the first contact stuff, or the contact, so Caine has arrived at the planet Tuxar with a Navy ship and a human ship and several accompanying vessels, and he's got with him the Slathrithi ambassador, who we got to know quite well in the last book, Raising Caine, Ythriash, I believe. Ythriash.
Yes,
He was pretty fascinating the way he understood and kind of learned to capitalize on the Slothrisi's weird characteristics. Um, can you tell us about his character a little and get us into what they are trying to accomplish on Turksar?
So what Yithri Aash is really not there at Turksar much to accomplish Slasrithi objectives per se, except for the fact that they overlap human objectives, which is we just finished a war, let's not have another one starting up. And that's what they're there to prevent. They have heard radio chatter, I'm going to put it anachronistic radio chatter, on the colony world of Turksar, which indicates, or would seem to indicate, that there are humans present on that planet, possibly conducting something that sounds like combat operations against the locals. This is not only untoward and alarming, it is frankly thought to be impossible. The reason for this is that if you were to look at the maps in the books, which, by the way, are exacting recreations of the actual arrangements of the stars in our own stellar neighborhood, the shift range of human ships cannot have gotten them to this planet. Couldn't have been done. So how are there humans there? And they don't sound like any humans that would have been dispatched from a conventional unit, and yet there they are. And if this continues to go on, this could, of course, be could be seen as prelude to invasion, raiding, whatever the case may be. The Hukhruk are temperamentally not necessarily, overly eager to make those sort of distinctions, and we could have yet more problems. So the Slasrithi and the human objectives in this case are the same, which is we need to go there, we need to find what humans are doing this, and we need to take them away, whatever the circumstances are. There's no way to know what they are, so it's a mission that has an objective, but the amount of advanced intelligence is, I would say, from anybody in that field's professional standpoint, shockingly and dangerously limited, and that, of course, creates much of the drama and much of the mystery to be unraveled over the course of Caine's mutiny. So that's their objective arriving there. In terms of the Slasrithi, I guess you could say leveraging the peculiarities of their species, to give the listeners a little bit of a sense of what that is, as comes up at one point in trying to understand them, the Yithri Aash, who is to try to create equivalence between their, if you will, political control or civic control positions and ours is almost meaningless. He is what's called a prime ratiocinator, and that makes him kind of potential provincial governor, diplomat, minister plenipotentiary, translator, head liaison. It's a role that really we don't have. But in the course of trying to get us to understand the Slasrithi and why they need the humans for their, if you will, our aggressive instincts, but our managed aggressive instincts, he comes up with this example. You have what's called a fight or flight reflex. What if you didn't have the fight? What if your only reflex was flight? And he says, that's us. And we can arrive at some of the solutions you come to, but it's never reflexive for us. Actually, as he points out, neurologically, we have slightly better reaction times than you do. But the problem is, we just don't think that way. And we've also learned that there's a part of their species that used to think that way more than the rest of them, but that one has been filtered out. And one of the things that happened in the last book, Raising Caine, is that they are undertaking, if you will, a desperate mission to try to reintroduce that taxon, that subtaxon, which is called the indagator, or if you will, the pioneer or the searcher taxon. And this actually puts humans, therefore, in the very unusual circumstance of feeling like, wait a minute, so what are we, the muscle? You're the brains and we're the muscle? How does that work? And it is an ongoing dynamic that is it gets into a lot of the things that make Slasrithi very alien from us. And I think also challenges the notion that the human worldview is necessarily the best, the logical, or the inevitable. The Slasrithi have a pretty coherent, and I think it pretty much sticks together, evolutionary history. One of the things I do when I write an alien species is I not only look at the planet and the biomes in which they evolved, I have a dawn of intelligence story. I've referred to this a number of times, which is, for instance, for humans, I think the best dawn of intelligence story I've ever seen is in 2001 Space Odyssey, when we see the 8th Moon Watcher who discovers the bone as tool, weapon, et cetera, and we sort of get that idea, this is how things change. This is where we learn the skills that put us on the path of dominant evolution in our biosphere. The Slasrithi have one too. It's very different. I'm not going to take up our time here to go into what it is, but trust me, it's very different. And that difference comes all the way down through into trying to figure out, the Slasrithi perspective is, but from the macro perspective, it makes more sense that we do what we're good at and you do what you're good at. And the humans are saying, yeah, but we're all about individual rights as well, and you're telling us that our children have to die because they're fated to that and you're not. So this is the sort of stuff where both people are coming to the table honestly, and yet there are these considerable divisions that are going to have to be negotiated as the series goes on.
Yeah. Well, you have one of the things about all the books in the series is this care you take in really differentiating and creating the species. It really is fun to get to know them. There's a lot of that in we learn a lot about the Slasrithi in Raising Caine. There's so much about Caine's mutiny we can't discuss without throwing some major spoilers out there. There's a lot of very cool and unexpected stuff going down on Turksar, and it involves a lot of war fighting. At the start of the book, we meet one of the Hukrook, that is, who is not such a victim of their caste system that he can't see outside the box. And explain to us a little bit about their caste system and sort of, if you can, situate Yar Gruach, our character, our sympathetic character within it.
So Yar Gruach is from the new families. What the new families are, this requires a brief trip into history. So the Hukrook are highly distinct in terms by gender, and that has to do with the fact that they are an extremely combat-oriented society. Property is always potentially exchanged by challenge, although challenge is not always physical combat. As with us, in many of our old dueling societies, the person who tendered the challenge got the right to get satisfaction, but the person who took the challenge, received and agreed to it, usually was able to decide the weapons or even the nature that the challenge takes. That also holds true amongst the Hukrook, and they have a very broad allowance of what might constitute a challenge. So not everything is warlike, and you have to be very careful, because if you lose a challenge, your possessions are forfeit, which has a tendency to make sure that the people who are doing most of the challenges, if their families agree to it, it usually means they don't have a lot to lose. So there are things that keep the society from constantly coming apart at the seams. But the unfortunate, and this was quite intentional on my part, this puts the females of the species, and it is of all the species in the book, they are by far the most like us in a whole bunch of ways. One of which is that you're looking at a heterosexual reproductive model, and therefore population is key to power. Population therefore means how many individuals do you have who are producing population, and consequently you have what would be to a human perspective a horrifically sort of primitive and oppressive reaction towards females in this society. Now, they are utterly protected They are absolutely, they're not part of the challenge structure. It is considered an egregious act that warfare should spill over and hit what are called, in their caste system, the unhonored, which are those who have not yet come of age, and any female. And it is highly protective of them. It actually reveres both of those in a lot of ways, but is very, very is highly, highly restrictive on what they may do. Now, this has gone on for many, many thousands of years. They are probably one of the societies with the least frequent, if what I would call sort of sine wave of change running through their society. But one of the things that began happening with their age of industrialization is that so many families were then defeated so profoundly in wars that their families were shattered, they were not absorbed into other families, and they became part of a structure called the new families. The new families have a very different attitude towards sex and gender. They have a very different attitude towards role. They have a very different attitude towards property, and they are seen as an underclass by what are called the old families, who are, if you will, the sort of representatives and hierarchs of these older, traditional, highly honor-bound, highly challenge-oriented sort of culture that's come up for thousands and thousands of years. It is by no means a uniform culture, but it is a culture in which it is a survival of the fittest, and the fittest tend to impose their notions, their language, their most of the ways that they, if you will, pattern their society are imposed upon those who have been conquered. So there is a bit of a tendency just from that process to create a kind of a much greater sense of cultural homogeneity across the entirety of the species than you would, for instance, than we observe on Earth. Yargrau is a member of the new families, so he was not brought up. He was not not a fortunate son, and although he was very, very gifted, so he was sort of pulled out and sent back to the home world to be educated. However, the stigma of being new family continues with him, and he's also considered something of a runt. He's only like about 6'3" or 6'4", so he's considered a very, very small Hukra. Well, what he winds up specializing in, and it's how he gets involved in the series, is he's made the study of humans his specialty, because whereas we have been sending our signals out into space willy-nilly ever since we got the capability to do broadcast, the Hukra did not, and detected ours, and began to, after having some difficulty figuring out how to decipher it or essentially modulate the signal to get useful information, we became an object of remote study via our media. There's a moment of terror, if you think about it, that we should be judged by our television and radio. But that's what he does, and he learns languages that way, and that is why he is included on the diplomatic mission in the very first book, and his position is advocate to the unhonored, which means that the alien species, from the Hukra standpoint, the alien species need somebody to speak for them and to actually make respectful approach to the honored, the first voice of the what's called the Hukra Patra Juridica, and that's how he sort of gets involved. He is, again, a little bit like Caine. He's an out-of-the-box thinker. He is able to see the world through a set of lenses that are not innately those of his own culture. And this is one of the themes, I guess you could say, that recurs with a lot of the individuals who are the ambassadors or the contact individual. Same thing for the Arad Kur, that they are very often, to some degree, on the level of almost being outcasts in their own society, because they are the ones who are likely to say, wait a minute, have we really looked at this the way they see it? Well, in times of stress, that can be seen as sounding disloyal, or like you're a collaborationist, or an appeasementist, but that is actually kind of the perspective you need to be able to assess your potential adversary or newcomer, as the case may be. So that's one of the constants that sort of follows through the series.
That kind of puts him under suspicion within his. It seems like every encounter between the Hukruk are is a dominance and or sort of a pick-on display. First and foremost, it's like this dominance ritual, and then maybe a communication takes place. And so he's constantly having to work his way around his officious overseers, right?
Absolutely, and the situation is particularly difficult on Turksar, which is his old homeworld, but he hadn't been back there for a long time because he was educated on the homeworld, the species world of origin, I should say. There is a situation there where the old respected, if you will, patriarch, the voice, as they're called, is dying, and there's some interesting reasons why he is that create doubled resentments for humans. And he's worried about his son, who's actually the second son. The first one was killed in the war, really having the authority to take over. And that son is, in fact, very aware of that. And so that in addition to what would be the normal sort of dominance contest and sort of check display and proof that operates inside of Khukhruk society between the different clans and houses, this is more so because he's got that extra bit of discomfort and uncertainty. Am I really going to be able to step into the old man's shoes here and maintain control? And if I don't, I'll probably get challenged, and at some point I'll lose, and then they'll take everything away from us, my family, my moiety, as the case may be. And so he's got it. He has a sort of extra measure of concern with asserting dominance. And while Yargrauf is not at all eager to sort of be the nail that sticks up out of the rug, no one else is really willing to see an alternative explanation for why there are humans on Turksar who seem to be raiding them. And that creates a sort of creates a conflict he'd rather not have, but he can't step away from, because if he does, he feels that the results could be just that much worse.
Yeah. That was part one of a two-part interview with Charles E. Gannon discussing his new book in the Caine Riordan series, Caine's Mutiny. Part two and the conclusion will be available next time on the podcast. Now we continue with our complete audiobook serialization of David Drake's The Sea Without a Shore. It seems Cinnabar's chief spy master is a mother also, and her son is determined to search for treasure in the midst of a civil war. Who better to hold the boy's hand and to take the blows directed at him than Captain Daniel Leary, the Republic of Cinnabar Navy's troubleshooter, and his friend the cyberspy Adele Mundy. The only thing certain in the struggle for control of the mining planet Corsaira is that the rival parties are more dangerous to their own allies than to their opponents. Daniel and Adele face kidnappers, pirates, and a death squad even before they can get to the real business of ending the war on Corsaira and bringing their charge home, maybe along with ancient alien treasure. Now here is the next entry of David Drake's The Sea Without a Shore.
Daniel awakened in his hammock. He didn't know where he was, neither what planet he was on nor what he was doing there. "Here." "Daniel," said Adele's voice, bringing him fully alert and back to his present in the conference room, where he had slung a hammock instead of returning to his cubicle aboard the Kaisha. "Hang on," said Hogg. His feet slapped the floor, which was sheeting like the walls and roof. Daniel's eyes adapted to the faint light from beneath the eaves of the quickly constructed building. 20-centimeter-high poles from the top of the wall supported the peaked roof. The roof overhang covered the gap, but it allowed in air and enough light to be noticeable in the otherwise complete darkness. Daniel sneezed. His nose was stuffy from residues of the freshly welded plastic and the stabilizers mixed with the mud pumped into the gap between the sheeting. When the mud hardened, the sandwich would be weatherproof and excellent insulation, but for the moment it was still curing. Hogg shoved the door open and unhooked one end of his hammock. He had slung it across the doorway from eye bolts set into the walls. Daniel got up also. His hammock was across a back corner of the room, one bolt in either wall. He was still fully dressed, though he'd taken off his boots. There was a jury-rigged power line from the fusion bottle in the headquarters dugout, but the light switch was near the door. "Get the lights," Daniel said as he bent to slip on his boots. The 3 glow strips on the underside of the roof flickered to what was painful brilliance for a moment. Adele entered ahead of a burly Pantalarian sergeant. A spy? Does she have agents inside Haplinger? "Captain Leary," she said, reverting to formality now that he was awake. "This is Commissioner Arnaud, who wants to discuss his future with you." Daniel laughed, then sneezed again. An Iskian freighter had landed just after sundown. Ozone from its thrusters still lingered in the humid air. Most of the ships in Brotherhood Harbor were waiting for at least a formal armistice before they hopped to Hablinger with building materials, but the Iskians had their own reasons for wanting to arrive immediately. "Have a seat, Commissioner," Daniel said as he pulled out a chair for himself from the table. "When I saw you, I was only mildly surprised to learn that Lady Mundy had an agent within the Pantalarian Expeditionary Force. I was much more surprised when she announced who you really are." Like the buildings, the furniture had been manufactured from plastic tubes and sheeting in the past few hours. It was sturdy and serviceable, though it made the steel stampings of a warship look like aesthetic masterpieces by contrast. Arnaud remained standing, his hands gripped together at waist level. "I've come to accept your terms, Leary," he said. "I haven't stated any terms," Daniel said. He frowned slightly. "Though if Lady Mundy has, then—" "She has not," Arnaud said. "When I have a negotiating position, I negotiate. When I do not, as now, I throw myself on the victor's mercy. State your terms, sir, and I will accept them." He swallowed and added, "I hope the lives of my troops can be spared, as your initial announcement stated." Daniel pulled out a second chair and turned it to face his, then sat down. "I think we can do better than that, Commissioner," he said. "But please sit. I don't want to look up at you, and I sure don't want to stand. It's been a long day." "Yes," said the Pantalarian, "it has." Arnaud sat. He tried to brace himself on the chair back, but collapsed onto the seat when he was halfway down. He had looked worn but alert initially. Now his face had a greenish pallor, which was only partially caused by the bioluminescent glow strips. The door closed behind Hogg. He and Tovera had stepped outside. Adele was in a chair beside the door, her data unit on her lap. Except for the occasional flicker of her wands, she was as unobtrusive as the dull pink surface of the plastic walls. "First," Daniel said. He had rehearsed this meeting, but he hadn't expected it to come so suddenly or here. "I've arranged with Ischia to repatriate your troops. With the Monfiore clan, technically, but this matter is going to require much greater resources than they themselves can provide. That's to everyone's benefit, as the Monfiores become benefactors of all Ischia, instead of being wealthy profiteers in the midst of hostile neighbors." Arnaud pursed his lips. "That will be an expensive proposition," he said. "I can't commit the council to paying for it, the Pantalarian Council, that is." He shook his head angrily, glaring at the floor. "In fact, I don't think that anything I appeared to support would pass a council vote. I'm telling you this because I don't want to see my troops sold into slavery to pay the cost of their transportation." His mouth worked as though he were about to spit, but he swallowed instead. "Not that I'm likely to survive long enough to see the final outcome." Daniel made a dismissive gesture with his left hand. "One thing at a time," he said. There was a console of reasonable capacity at the other end of the table, but he didn't think he needed it now. "The transportation costs will be covered by trade concessions, but that's in the future. The most immediate question I see—" He grinned. It was true that the Monfiores gained in the long term by being forced to share their profits with their neighbors. This plan, too, benefited all parties, which pleased Daniel for its neatness as well as other virtues. "Is what you would consider the best conceivable outcome to the present situation, from your viewpoint?" "Asylum for me on Cinnabar." Arnaud said. The rest of my force returns to Pantelleria with an undertaking by the Council not to retaliate against them, guaranteed by the Cinnabar Senate. He shrugged. If you can arrange that, he said, you'd be welcome to my firstborn if I had children. I could manage a nephew or two. Despite the joking bravado, Daniel could see real hope in the Pantellerian's expression. It was easy to like Arnaud. He had come himself instead of sending an envoy, and his first concern was for his troops. You've told me what you consider the best practical outcome, Daniel said. But that's not what I asked you. What do you consider the best conceivable outcome? Arnaud's face hardened slightly. You surrender Corcyra to me, he said after a moment, which, to be honest, I don't believe you have the power to do, but you've surprised me in the past. He nodded toward Adele. You and Lady Mundy have. Wouldn't you rather be ruler of Pantelleria? Daniel said. He smiled more broadly. Arnaud pushed his fingertips together hard at chest height. Explain what you mean, he said. Will your troops support you? Daniel said. I think they would support me a long way, yes, Arnaud said. If I get them out of this mess alive, most of them would support me well beyond common sense. But I couldn't conquer Pantelleria with this force. I couldn't even conquer Corcyra, though. His eyes narrowed with a thought. The plan Lady Mundy tricked me with, that might have worked. I still think it would have worked, and she said it was your plan. Are you offering to support me, Leary? Daniel laughed as though the offer was a joke. At the words, though, his mind began considering what it would take and what resources he might be able to raise on Cinnabar. No. Before he could speak, Adele said, I can assure you as an official of Cinnabar, Commissioner Arnaud, that the Republic's government would forbid any action by a citizen which would precipitate renewed war with the Alliance, as the armed overthrow of Pantelleria by an RCN officer would certainly do. I wasn't going to do it anyway, Daniel thought. His momentary irritation melted away. But that's an aspect of the business that I hadn't considered. He grinned at Adele, then said to Arnaud, No, you couldn't conquer Pantelleria. But according to my sources, Adele, the Council of 20 isn't very popular. Things were all right just after Guarantor Pora's thugs were thrown out, but right now a lot of folks seem to think that the Council is a bunch of rich people screwing every piastre they can get out of everybody else. Not so? Go on, Leary, Arnaud said, his face almost blank. But keep in mind that I'm not exactly a man of the people myself. I've improved the family fortune considerably, thanks to investment by Bantry Holdings in some measure. His sudden smile was half amused, half mocking. But we Arnauds are still one of the oldest families on Pantelleria. You may have more popular support than you believe, Commissioner, Adele said. Your shipyard is regarded as a good place to work, and you're a great deal more approachable than many of your nouveau riche fellows on the Council. Your popularity with the public is one of the reasons the rest of the Council has been trying to arrange the defeat of your expeditionary force as soon as you lifted from Pantelleria. It certainly seems like that, Arnaud said. You know, I've had to use my own money to pay the troops for the past 3 months. The Council hasn't transferred money into the expedition's account. I can show you internal communications among your fellows, Adele said, though referring to the other councillors as your fellows is probably a misnomer. But that doesn't matter now. No, said Daniel. Arnaud was seated between him and Adele, so the commissioner was snapping his head around like a spectator at a tennis match. Ordinary people don't have to support you so long as they don't oppose you, as the residents of Corcyra most certainly have been doing. I have provided Captain Leary with a breakdown of the private troops in the service of your other councillors, Adele said. He is convinced that the force available to you would be sufficient to defeat. You'll scare them into taking their badges off and hiding, Daniel said, or simply overawe them, Adele went on, nodding. And your forces aren't simply those you brought to Corcyra, Commissioner, Daniel said, leaning forward. There are other troops here who would be more than happy to follow you to Pantelleria, to go back in many cases. He and Adele were selling Arnaud on their plan. It was a good course for the Pantalarian, but it was the only course which would also accomplish all of Daniel's objectives. Arnaud blinked and stiffened. "No," he said. "You mean the exiles, don't you? I won't do that." "The Self-Defense Regiment and the Navy of Free Corsaira," Daniel said, keeping his voice genially calm, "which in the past have been paid by exiles, I believe, but that needn't continue to be the case, and the Corsairan garrison, whose members will be particularly willing to leave here. Their commander, Colonel Bourbon, is both competent and honest." "Look, I know the people, the families mostly, who bolted here when the Alliance pulled off of Pantelleria," Arnaud said. "I don't have problems with them, no more than usual anyway. I was in pretty tight with Pora's last administrator myself, to tell the truth. But I'm not going to have a bloodbath back at home or a return to Alliance control. That's what they'll want, some of them." "What most of them want," said Adele, "is a return of their property on Pantelleria, and revenge against the political enemies who forced them into exile and expropriated that property, of course. But none of them, and not all of them together, can force through that agenda over your opposition." A computer-synthesized voice would have had more warmth. It would have been programmed to seem human. Adele didn't bother to do so, and at that, her cold, precise delivery gave the words the solid certainty of a stone wall. "You're buying internal peace for your planet," Daniel said. "That's a very good return for simply giving back the property of fellow citizens. The Council of 20 had a good opportunity to bring Pantelleria together when the Alliance left. Instead, you simply made yourselves richer. You did, Commissioner." Arnaud's immediate response was an angry glare. Then he coughed a laugh and said, "Point taken. The silver lining in this is that because the spoils were divided pretty much among council members, it'll be relatively easy for us to correct our mistake, although—" His eyes went unfocused as his mind leaped to a different thought. "Not all of my colleagues will see what we did as a mistake. The Alliance administrators had us at each other's throats all the time they were in charge. You can say we should have done better when they left, but what happened to most of the exiles was no more than justice for what they'd done to others." "All the more reason to stop doing Guarantor Pora's work for him, I would think," snapped Adele. "And your colleagues don't have 5,000 troops with combat experience," Daniel said. "Don't sell your force short, Arnaud. No, they're not a land force commando, but they've trained together, they've been shot at, and they've shot back. That puts them in a whole different class from what anybody else on Pantelleria has obeying his orders." "Look," said Arnaud. He stood up abruptly. "Look, I don't want to be dictator of Pantelleria. I don't want to be a penny anti-Pora myself." "Then don't be," said Adele. She didn't raise her voice, but her words snapped like a whip. The Council of 20 was supposed to be a transition to the elected assembly that ruled Pantelleria before you were absorbed into the Alliance. Go back and tell your colleagues that the Council is going to hold elections for a new assembly in 3 months' time." "But," Arnaud said. "But nothing," Daniel said. "You've got 5,000 veteran votes for the proposition, and everybody on the planet except maybe a few of your colleagues will support the idea. And if any other councillors really want to make an issue of it, put them in jail for a few days." "You might find that more of the Council is on your side than you expect," Adele said. "According to my information, Pantelleria had been a major Alliance ally during the war. Mistress Sand's array of spies there obviously hadn't been disbanded when the Treaty of Amiens was signed. Some of the minor councillors are concerned at the chance of civil war between their more powerful colleagues, and the smarter councillors—" Adele's smile was the visual equivalent of her clipped tone. "Not a majority, I fear. The smarter councillors, as I said, are concerned about revolution if things don't change. Both concerns are valid, even if Alliance agents don't work to increase their likelihood, which is also a valid concern." "Lady Monday and I have seen revolutions," Daniel said. "We've seen the next thing to revolution on Cinnabar, and it was the blessing of heaven that it wasn't the real thing. If you go home and knock a few of the harder heads together, you'll be doing everyone on Pantelleria a favor." "Including the people who curse you every day till they die," said Adele, "because they don't have your good sense." "They also don't have your army," Daniel said. So long as you're satisfied with being rich and powerful, my bet is that your rich, powerful colleagues will come to believe that you're offering a better alternative than hanging from a lamppost. Now, are you willing to try?" Arnaud gave Daniel a lopsided smile and sat down again. "I'd been wondering what I was going to do with myself on Cinnabar," he said. "I guess that on balance I'd rather go back to Pantelleria and straighten things out. I knew something had to be done before I brought the army here, and from what you tell me, things haven't gotten better." He took a deep breath. "All right, Leary, what's the next step?" "The next step," Daniel said, "is that we tell Hogg and Tovera to let in the Corsiran leaders and Giorgio Monfiore. I'm sure that Lady Mundy summoned them while we've been talking." Adele nodded agreement and said, "I have." Her smile was almost that of a normal person. "We've got a great deal of negotiating to do," Daniel said, rising to walk to the door. "But Corsiera and Pantelleria both will gain from it. And with luck, so will Ricard Cleveland, who's the reason I came here in the first place."
That was another entry in our complete audiobook serialization of The Sea Without a Shore by David Drake. And that's it for the podcast. Thanks to Audible.com and to Christopher Rocchio, and to podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz.
And a crankcase built of quantum virtual gears and oiled by the sweet crude dripping from the Milky Way. Plus the thanks and praise and honks of a California freeway's worth of grateful readers for Charles E. Gannon, author of Caine's Mutiny.
Please join us next time here at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy, and keep reaching for the stars.